location. That room being room 217. I think it kinda scared his socks off just a little bit, so he only stayed in the room one night. But that night he had a nightmare, and by the time he woke up, he pretty much had the whole storyline of The Shining in his head and ready to go. So yeah, the Overlook Hotel in The Shining was inspired by the Stanley Hotel. As I mentioned, room 217 is supposedly one of the most haunted rooms there. Let me tell you a little. Back in 1911, there was some type of power outage at the hotel, right? One of the maids, her name was Elizabeth Wilson. She went to take a lit candle to the presidential suite, room 217. But what she didn't know was that there was actually a gas leak in that room. So when she walked inside the room with this lit candle, an explosion happened and it actually flung her all the way to the dining room, which was one story down. She suffered some broken bones and other injuries, but she did survive the whole ordeal. But the thing is, even after she passed away, years after the explosion happened, years after she continued working, her spirit is said to still live in that room to this day. Guests have reported hearing weeping sounds coming from 217, shadows going straight through walls, returning to the room and finding their bags unpacked with their clothes folded and neatly put away. Creepy. Room 428 is known to have the spirit of an unknown but very friendly cowboy. Apparently, he just kind of paces the room sometimes or just stands in the corner. I read that he's so nice that he'll even leave the room if you simply ask him to. And for the ladies, he likes to give goodnight kisses on the forehead. Creepily sweet. Apparently, there was once an employee at the hotel named Paul. He used to enforce the 11 p.m. curfew at the hotel. And even though he has passed on, I heard that if you stay in the concert hall just a minute too late, you may just hear him tell you to get out. Or you may actually feel the sensation of being nudged out of the door. You may also hear the sound of a piano playing in the concert hall, even when it's empty, because the wife of the founder of the hotel, Flora Stanley, she still loves showing off her piano playing skills. There's a lot going on at this hotel. Too much for me personally, but if you ever decide to book a room there, tell me about it, babe. I'm not coming, but tell me about it. So, in 1941, there was an older couple who lived in Denver, Colorado. The husband's name was Philip Peters. He was 73 years old. And his wife was Helen Peters. Around this time, Mrs. Peters was actually in the hospital recovering from a broken hip. So Mr. Peters would kind of be in and out of the hospital, just visiting and checking on his wife. Super sweet. I just love older couples. So while his wife was in the hospital, the neighbors actually invited Mr. Peters over every night to make sure he had dinner and leftovers for lunch the next day. Also, just so he wouldn't be so alone while his wife was away. Well, one day Mr. Peters didn't show up for dinner, and that worried the neighbor, so they called police to go check on him. That's when he was found in his home, deceased. start reporting that there were some strange things going on in the house. Weird noises, food missing from the kitchen, things rearranging themselves or not being in the place that they left them at. So they started to believe that the house was haunted as well. Mrs. Peters' friend ended up moving out because things were just getting too creepy. Mrs. Peters moved out also. She moved in with her and Mr. Peters' son. After that, the house was just left empty, but neighbors would claim to hear strange noises coming from the house. They would also report a very foul smell coming from the house, but whenever police went and searched, they found nothing and no one. Eventually, the department decided to station 2 police officers outside the house so that they would be present in case something did happen. They'd be there to see it and they could act on it immediately. And that's exactly what happened. While they were sitting outside the house, they happened to spot a person moving inside the house. When they ran inside and searched, they couldn't find anyone at first. Then they heard a tiny noise upstairs. When they went up there, they opened a closet door, and right before their eyes, there was a pair of human legs hanging from a small opening that led to the attic. This person was climbing their way into the attic, but at the very last second, the police were able to grab onto their legs and pull them back down. According to Denver Police Chief James Childers, what they found was the strangest looking human he had ever seen. He was a tall man, just under 6 feet, but thin as a wilted weed. His hair hung low over his ears, and his skin was the ugly, unwashed gray of an overcast sky. This man would turn out to be Theodore Conies. Now, let's go back. Theodore and Mr. Peters actually knew each other. They met at the Denver Guitar Club, right? Theodore had a hard time keeping a job due to some health issues, and he really didn't have a place to live either. So one day, Theodore decided to go to the Peters house to ask for some money and maybe some food to eat. But when he got there, no one answered the door. No one was home. This was around the time that Mrs. Peters was in the hospital for a broken hip. So Mr. Peters was actually at the hospital visiting her at that time. When Theodore realized that no one was home, he broke in and he stole some food and whatever else he might have needed. A few days later, he came back again to do the same thing, but this time he decided that it would be nice to just stay in the house permanently. So he searched around and he found that small opening that led up to the attic, right? And he made that his home. For 5 weeks, he lived up there. He would only come out for food and stuff whenever he heard Mr. Peters leaving. Then one day he came down from the attic after thinking he heard Mr. Peters leave. He went to the refrigerator, and while he was looking through it, Mr. Peters, who obviously had not left the house, found him right there in the kitchen. He knew who he was looking at, but he had no idea how he got in his house, what he was doing. But when Theodore realized that he was caught, the first thing he thought to do was kill Mr. Peters. After that, he just continued living in the attic of the house, stealing food, moving things, causing Mrs. Peters and her friend to think that the house was haunted, when really it was just him the whole time. He had actually been up there for a while too. so he was able to slide in and out fairly easily. And apparently the area smelled so bad because he had collected his waste up there. On top of that, he hadn't had a bath the entire time. Anyway, an officer said a man would have to be a spider to stand it long up there because it was so small and cramped. So Theodore eventually became known as the Denver Spider-Man. He was charged and convicted of murder, and he received a life sentence. He passed away in the penitentiary in 1967. So there's this neighborhood in Denver, Colorado named Cheeseman Park, right? It covers around 80 acres of land. There seems to be a lot of apartment buildings in this area. The pavilion is here, beautiful walking trails and greenery. Lots of space to just roam around and chill. Some famous events happen here. It's really quite beautiful. But its history, not so beautiful. Before Cheeseman Park was a park, it was actually a cemetery. Let me tell you about it. The cemetery was either called Prospect Hill Cemetery or Mount Prospect Cemetery. I kept seeing both names while I was researching, so I'm really not sure. But it first opened back in 1858, and for a while it was being used a pretty good bit. The owner originally intended for it to be used for the burial of wealthy, influential people. Then the outer edge of the cemetery would be used for criminals and poor people. The middle class people would have a designated area as well. But remember, it was mainly for the burial of wealthy people. Now, like I said, the cemetery was being used a pretty good bit, but not in the way that the owner intended. Instead of a lot of wealthy people being buried there like he wanted, it seemed like they would only have outlaws, poor people, and people who had passed away from certain diseases coming in back to back to back. This kind of gave the cemetery a not so good name. The wealthy didn't want any dealings with that, so they would get buried elsewhere. So the owner would eventually leave Denver, and the cemetery just became a mess. It wasn't kept up well. The graves were vandalized, headstones were kicked over. It was over with for this place. No one wanted to be affiliated at that point. Just bad. So the city of Denver decided that they needed to do something with this area. They came up with a plan to turn the cemetery into a park instead. To do this, they would have to remove all 5,000 of the bodies buried on this land and bury them elsewhere. So they started the process of moving the bodies, but it was happening very slowly. Apparently they only moved about 700 bodies in the first few years. So to make the process a bit speedier, hear whispers all jumbled together, moaning. Ghostly children have been seen playing in the park at night. Misty, shadowy figures knocking on doors and windows at nearby residences, but the person knocking is never actually seen. That's too much for me. Downright creepy. There's another supposedly haunted hotel in Glenwood Springs, Colorado, named Hotel Colorado. And according to Thrillist.com, it opened in 1893, and the massive space has served as a hotel, plus a hospital, plus a prison, plus a temporary White House, plus an alleged crematorium. That's a lot. So a lot of sources have said that the hotel was pretty much doomed from the start because it is standing on land that originally belonged to Native Americans. When they were told to leave this land, they allegedly put a curse on it. I don't know what type of curse this was supposed to be exactly, but I'm sure it was for very bad things to happen to whatever would come of this land since it was taken away from them. So yeah, that supposedly happened, and then up came Hotel Colorado, right there on the land. The hotel hosted many rather familiar people such as Theodore Roosevelt, the unsinkable Molly Brown, President William Taft, even Al Capone, and other gangsters. Apparently, during World War II, the hotel was converted into a hospital for the soldiers. Those who passed away, their bodies were taken down to the basement, which was being used as a morgue. That's a scary thing to think about. That would honestly bother me a bit. I'm imagining just sitting in one of their hotel rooms, thinking about the fact that there was actually a morgue just beneath me in the same building. I know that creepy things happen everywhere, but to know that there was a morgue there, I wouldn't be able to stay there. And also the fact that the room I'm staying in might just be one of the rooms that a soldier passed away in. That's too much for my brain to rest. But anyway, to add on to the fact that numerous people had passed away in this hotel already during the war while it was still being used as a hospital. There was a nurse named Bobby working there, and she was involved in a love triangle. She was allegedly killed there by one of her jealous lovers, who was an officer stationed there at the site. But they say she's still present at the hotel today. It is said that around lunch and dinner time in the dining area, you can smell the scent of gardenia perfume trailing from the table that Bobby used to sit at all the time to the buffet line and all the way back to Bobby's table. It's weird because that perfume is not in production anymore. Apparently it was around heavily in the 30s and 40s, which would have been around the time that Bobby was present there, so it makes you think. They say that the room she was killed in actually has so much activity that they can't even put guests in there anymore. Instead, they just use it for storage now. Some people think the founder of the hotel, Walter, still roams around as well. People have claimed to see him on multiple different occasions, and they say that you can actually smell cigar smoke inside the hotel sometimes. But the hotel hasn't allowed anyone to smoke inside for decades. So they say that's how you know whenever Walter is around. There's also this creepy story